honoris causa for independent work in health and political science from the Open International University for Complementary Medicines in Colombo, Sri Lanka in November 1994. He co-authored with Jean Manning the book Angels Don't Play This HAARP, Advances in Tesla Technology. His latest work is Controlling the Human Mind, the Technologies of Political Controls or Tools for Peak Performance. He has also appeared on dozens of television documentaries and other programs throughout the world, including BBC TV, CBC TV, Telemundo, and others. Nick Begich has served as an expert witness and speaker before the European Parliament. He has spoken on various issues for groups representing citizens' concerns, statement and elected officials, scientists, and others. So, you've got the floor.
Hello, and thank you for being here, and thank you to Peter and the rest of the team for putting this together. Everyone hears me okay, yes? In the back? Okay, good. All right, I want to give a little bit of background in terms of my interest in these areas, and for those that don't know my family story, it really goes back quite a ways. My father was in the United States Congress in the early 1970s during the Nixon administration. He was lost on a plane with Hale Boggs. Some of you may remember this if you've got a little bit of gray hair. Hale Boggs was our House Majority Leader at the time, one of the most powerful people in the United States Congress. He was also a Warren Commissioner. He had a strong dislike for J. Edgar Hoover because he basically read everybody's mail, tapped everybody's phones, including the United States Congress, and then essentially blackmailed political leaders to follow whatever script he laid out. Boggs was a pretty outspoken individual. At the time, it was just before the second election of Richard Nixon. Boggs came to Alaska to work on my father's campaign, which would have been his second term in the United States Congress. In Boggs, before they flew out on October 16th, 3 weeks before the second election of Richard Nixon, began to talk about this scandal brewing in Washington, D.C. In fact, that very scandal had it unfolded a little bit differently. For those that remember, the planes disappeared. 3 weeks later, Nixon's elected for his second term. It wasn't too much long after that the Watergate scandal broke. Agnew was thrown out of office. Ford moved up. Then Nixon resigned. Ford moved up again. For those that don't remember, Rockefeller then slid into the vice president's slot. And then one of the old Manson women from Charles Manson days tried to assassinate Ford, which would have put Rockefeller in the White House. What would have otherwise happened, most likely, the election would have taken place, Nixon would have won, Agnew and Nixon would have been thrown out at the same time. The Democrats controlled the Congress. The Speaker of the House would have elevated to the presidency, and the Democrats would have been in control. But the opposite, of course, happened, and history tells us a lot about what really happened there. 20 years later, there was a report, an investigative report by a publication called Roll Call in Washington, D.C. That report was looking into all these various congressional deaths. You know, plane crashes are kind of the hazard of political leadership, it seems like. But in researching that, what they found in the FBI files were a couple of telexes. This goes before fax machines, and telexes coming from California into Washington, D.C. reported that 2 people had been found at a crash site. Those sources were later looked at by the FBI to determine whether they were credible. Follow-up telex came through saying yes, they were. That plane was never recovered. There were no survivors officially, yet 20 years later we find out, in fact, there were. So I know about conspiracies, Conspiracies are the conversations that happen in a room like this when there's a bunch of people standing on the outside who might not agree with us. But the reality is, even in political life, even at the highest levels, things happen. Things happen that aren't easily explained, and maybe a few decades go by before the truth is finally revealed. So I have a strong motivation foundationally in terms of how I approach controversial issues. I don't do it with fear. I've been doing this work for over 20 years. Fear isn't part of the equation. In fact, that is the absolute adversary for getting anything accomplished on this planet. My interest in these areas started with HAARP. And how many in this room do not know anything about HAARP? Okay, well that's a lot better than it used to be. All right, it used to be the other way around. 20 years of this work and the work of others have kind of brought this into a frame. So the first image, I'm going to use HAARP as sort of the backdrop as I move into the mind control, mind effects related technologies. This is just an image in my part of the world. I come from Alaska. I don't know if maybe I come the farthest for this presentation, but I appreciate being here and I appreciate the opportunity to inform people about this subject. So HAARP is a large array, a field of antennas in Alaska, currently 180 antennas. They're approximately 20 meters tall. They have a cross dipole, which you can see, which is the very top of these antennas. And what these are designed to do is focus or concentrate radio frequency energy into a relatively small space. If you think about the energy of a flashlight, for instance, or a torch, as they say here in Europe, I shine that against the wall. The beam starts out small and then it broadens as you get further away from the source. The same is true with radio frequency energy. You can think about it as an inverted funnel, starting here at the transmitter and then spreading out and getting thinner and thinner, less dense, which is why the further you get away from radio broadcast antennas, the weaker and weaker the signal. With HAARP, the opposite occurs. They have figured out a way through what's called Cyclotron Resonance, which would be focusing or concentrating the energy. So if you could visualize it, it would look like sort of a corkscrewing kind of motion that got smaller and smaller as you move further and further away from the transmitter. So it concentrates that energy or focuses that energy so that you can manipulate it in various ways. And so the HAARP array, which was originally designed by a gentleman, Bernard Eastland, who's now deceased, was intended to do a number of things as weapons applications. This is the earlier version when it was half the current size of the transmitter in Alaska. You can see the field of antennas. In this case, there were 90 antennas in the array. And another image as they expanded the array to 180. And another image showing the array. Now they also upgraded the technology pretty substantially over the years, so it became much more efficient. So with a much smaller system, you create much bigger effects. So what does it do? Essentially, it's sending energy or focusing energy up into an area known as the ionosphere, which in this image in miles, I apologize for that, approximately 37 miles to 620 miles out into space. Now this is a highly energized area. If you think about radio frequency signals or shortwave signals would come from the Earth, they bounce off of this and then bounce back down to the Earth to transmit over large distances. The ionosphere also is an area that can be disturbed by solar radiation from the sun. When it becomes destabilized, it interferes with terrestrial communications of every kind. So part of the idea in this technology was to learn how to stabilize the ionosphere during these periods or deliberately disrupt the ionosphere to interfere with communications on a global basis. Now what caught my interest when I first looked at this issue of HAARP was a very short article in a publication, an Australian publication, that talked about this big system in Alaska. Now I come from a family that's pretty politically engaged. Besides my dad being in the Congress, my younger brother just finished a term in the United States Senate. The family's been involved in politics a very long time. In Alaska, though we're a big region, we're a really small population, 700,000 people in our entire region. And when you think about big projects, you think you know something about them. Well, I'm reading about this project in my state in a journal in Australia, and I'm going, why doesn't anybody know about this? And so I decided I would go in and look into this issue independently, and I did, and I picked up maybe 30 articles and papers, design specifications and things, and with friends encouraging me to publish, I published the first article that I had written on HAARP back in 1994. So it's been a very long time ago. What also caught my interest was the idea that they were primarily utilizing, in some applications, extremely low frequency signals, or ELFs. These are signals that can be biologically active, can affect us as human beings, and in very specific ways. And in particular, certain applications of the technology, and this gives you sort of a graphic illustration of the focusing. And these view graphs actually were given to me by the inventor Bernard Eastland prior to his passing, and we utilized them in our publications and some of our work. So this gives you kind of a graphic showing the radio frequency from the array moving up into the ionosphere and focusing that energy. His initial concept was to create a global shield, to be able to utilize the natural magnetic field lines that surround the Earth, be able to punch energy into this and then create this kind of global shielding effect. And the idea was that any electronic device piercing that energy would be disrupted, like satellites, intercontinental ballistic missiles, virtually any electronic device that ran into this field of energy that was being amplified would be destroyed. Now, one of the other interesting parts of this, and this kind of shows that, again, utilizing one of Eastland's graphics. So you can see like a field line, and you see this corkscrewing energy going around it. That energy naturally is occurring from the southern polar regions into the northern polar regions. And in this case, they actually utilize the energy on the ground to couple with the natural energy, and then coming from the north to the south create this corkscrewing effect, which accelerates the electrons and then creates this global shield. Now that was his initial concept, and as a concept it caught the attention of a number of people and eventually got funding from the Congress, initially at 30 million, and over the last few decades now over almost 300 million, which in dollars is not a lot of money, but when you consider this is sort of the pinnacle of billions of dollars spent in ionospheric research over many decades. What caught my attention in terms of the technology of East, and I'm going to skip some of these that are not so relevant, was the idea that you could manipulate the ionosphere, and I'll use this as a better example. So one of the thoughts was that if you could punch or pulse energy into the ionosphere, so think about this energy going up, and like a hammer ringing a bell, every time it hits that ionosphere, the ionosphere itself vibrates, and then it begins to send a signal in the ELF range. So you have a high frequency signal going up, punching the ionosphere which is energized, then acts as a broadcast antenna in the sky, bringing back an ELF signal to the Earth. And in this case, covering an entire hemisphere. Now, ELF signals, extremely low frequency signals, are very long wavelengths. They penetrate the Earth and sea. They're utilized for communication with submarines, as example, at depth, because short wavelengths won't penetrate the Earth and sea. They're also used for what's called Earth-penetrating tomography, which in simple language or by analogy would be like X-raying the Earth or looking into the Earth for underground structures. But one of the side effects of ELF is the entrainment effect on the human mind, because ELF signals will lock onto in what's called a frequency following response. You can use a lot of different techniques to create a frequency following response. You can use flickering light, you can use binaural beat, which I'll explain in a few minutes. You can use electromagnetic fields, such as this, or even the power grid itself can be modulated in such a way to create a signal that the human body will join with, will couple with, and begin to follow. It doesn't take a great deal of energy to accomplish this. This is the one that triggered my real interest in HAARP, because this is the one that everybody kind of ignored and said, oh, In fact, the HAARP planners said, well, if ELF has a biological effect, it's a side effect, it's an unintended consequence. We heard that phrase earlier today. But I don't believe that. I believe that it's an intended consequence. It's intended to grade populations in very specific ways. Now, this book was mentioned by my friend earlier today, Between Two Ages by Zbigniew Brzezinski. And why this is an important book, it was written actually in 1973 when Brzezinski was at Columbia University. This is before he became National Security Advisor to President Carter. This is around the time that Kissinger and he and others were starting to think about the Trilateral Commission organizing this think tank, so to speak. Now, find this book. I really encourage you to find this book and read it, because it is not a prediction of what will come with technology. It's the blueprint, in fact. You can read this. When I first read it, he writes in a pretty convoluted style. It's a little difficult even in English to understand, but I really encourage you to read it, because he predicted the economic changes that took place, the political changes that took place in the world over the last 40 years with a great deal of accuracy. And some will say it really wasn't the prediction, it was the plan. If you look within this text, between pages 54 and 56, you'll see a section that's dedicated to the kind of technologies we're talking about today, mind control technologies. And what Zbigniew referenced was a guy named J.F. Gordon MacDonald, and he was a geophysicist at UCLA. He wrote a book, or actually a chapter in a book, and the chapter was called How to Wreck Your Environment, which this is before Earth Day, okay, so you could get away with that. It was 1969 when that book was actually published. But what he said that caught Zbigniew Brzezinski's attention was, he said, if we could ever figure out how to electronically stroke the ionosphere in just the right way, we could return a signal to the Earth that would influence the behavior of people over huge geographic areas. Now that's a pretty profound thing, but we didn't have a way to stroke the ionosphere in 1969. But we did by the 1990s, and that was in fact, and is in fact, the HAARP system that can accomplish this. So the idea was, it was kind of a gross sort of way, primitive if you will, but what the intention was that if you could pulse the ionosphere, return this ELF signal to the Earth, you could agitate the population in very specific ways. You could make them passive, less aggressive, or the opposite by just amplifying that signal. And I'll explain a little bit of that as we go on. The other person that comes out in the last presentations, Jose Delgado. And this book he wrote, Physical Control of the Mind Towards a Psycho-Civilized Society. And this is, again, 1960s book. Those images that you saw, and just a short video clip of Delgado's work, there is a good section in this text as well showing that. But in those days, they used implants. They had to physically put something in the brain, and what Jose Delgado originally did, he was actually educated in electrophysiology at the University of Madrid. He graduated in 1950. Electrophysiology as a degree field, thinking about it in 1950, now 65 years ago, most people don't even realize that's an area of higher education today, much less that far back. One of my mentors, Rejo Michela, he actually graduated University of Madrid 1958, and his area of interest was essentially the same. Biomagnetic and electric fields effects on human physiology, and he spent his career studying that. Delgado, at Yale University, he initially was mapping the brain of primates and humans by stimulating various portions of the brain to figure out what was responsible for what kind of activity. And then he began to utilize the implants in those dramatic ways in those film clips where the charging bull and he throws the switch and the bull stops, to demonstrate that you could take a creature from passive to highly aggressive to passive to highly aggressive, just like flipping on and off the lights in your living room. What Delgado discovered by the mid-80s is that you didn't need any implants. You just needed to manipulate the energy itself, and you didn't need a great deal of energy. Now, we've heard, I forget the amount of energy surrounding us now, was a quintillion, was I believe 18 zeros after the one. that we heard earlier. Back when I wrote the HAARP book in '94, just radio frequency energy alone, it was 200 million times more around us every day than nature created in 1994. Now when you think about it, what did Delgado discover? He discovered that 1/50th of the amount of energy in the natural background noise of the Earth was sufficient to manipulate the behavior of human beings if you could hit the right frequencies, if you could hit those window frequencies that stimulated that kind of activity. Now, if you think about this, again, by analogy, think about dialing through the radio stations on a radio. When you, in between the stations, you get the white noise, the static, you get no clear signal. But when you have resonance between the transmitter and the receiver, then you get a nice clear signal. And the same is true in our physiology. Whether you're looking at stimulating or affecting a specific element in the body, molecules in the body, cell structures, or organ structures, or even the human mind. It's about manipulating the underlying energy. When you think about medical science in terms of how the fork in the road is and how this kind of applies to why don't we know more about this today? Well, there's lots of literature now. 25,000 sources, I think we heard quoted earlier today. 25,000 sources talking about the energy interactions with the human body. That is a lot of information. But what happened in medical science? A lot of people that went into life sciences, they were really good in the chemistry, a little weak in the math. So they went to the life sciences. People a little better in the math, they went to physics. And then once upon a time, these two came together and we got biophysics, which is really the root of real health science. If you really want to get to the meat of it, you've got to get to the energetic interactions that create chemical reactions that then manifest in body. And that's what we kind of miss in so much of our medicine. We followed a pharmaceutical model as opposed to an electromagnetic model. In the 30s, prior to World War II, that fork in the road was being explored pretty aggressively, the energetic models, but they were somehow lost in that shuffle. And we ended up with a pharmaceutical industry, and the results of that I think we can all not be quite so proud of. In terms of where the technology is going and where a lot of the science is going, it will be electromedicine that cures most of what we call incurable. It will also be that which enhances or debilitates human consciousness itself. Now, Jose Delgado, when he figured out that you didn't need implants, you just need to manipulate the energy itself, this became kind of the essence of sort of where everything went from there. But I want to roll back a little bit back in time and talk more about the evolution of mind control as technology. Starting with the work at Harvard University of a gentleman, Estabrook, who was working in the Harvard hypnotherapy labs in the 1920s. You can look Estabrook up, look him up at the Library of Congress, and you'll see his list of publications, and I recommend that you do that. What he decided was that you could create what we would call today a Manchurian candidate. You could take certain individuals, put them in a very, very deep state of hypnosis, and then over a period of time, train them so they would be like this super spy that you could send into another country, and they'd hang out for a year or two, but if they got captured, they wouldn't really remember any of their former self, and then when they came back, in this case in the United States, that we would then give them the appropriate suggestions and then extract the intelligence from them. And this is what Estabrook was working on. By the 1930s, a lot of his work was being classified, and he continued to work in this field up through the 1960s. His last book, and I always like to read the last thing someone writes, because it tells you a lot about sort of the conclusions. Early things you might discard bits and pieces as science enlightens you and your experience enlightens you. And what he talked about in that last book were the experiments he was involved in using LSD and other hallucinogenics in mind control, which he actually talked about in a favorable sense. And for those that remember, the CIA was heavily involved in this in the 1960s. In fact, the whole area pre-1960s, going back even to the Korean War, which is sort of my next mark on the timeline. Korean War, we had prisoners, patriotic young Americans, come back from war, and they're handing out communist leaflets on street corners. And the term or the phrase brainwashing came into being. That's where it came from. It came from that series of events after the Korean War. The idea of being able to manipulate people's behavior and change them so profoundly became of interest to the predecessor of the Central Intelligence Agency and then later the Central Intelligence Agency. And what they looked at were lots of different ways to manipulate human behavior. Now, when I was researching my first book with Gene Manning, Angels Don't Play This Harp, I was looking for a good source document that would speak to this, because you always read about this in secondary, tertiary sources. And so I'm in a book room, a big surplus book room, and I'm telling this guy that I know, I really need this source, and as I'm having this conversation, I reach unconsciously behind me into a box and I pull out this book. This is a really interesting one. This is actually a presidential report. This is a report that was commissioned at the time, 1975, to look at the abuses of the CIA. Now, this came out of the Church Committee reports, which were congressional hearings that took place in the early 70s to investigate the abuses of the Central Intelligence Agency. The kind of abuses that we read about today, because nothing really changed. Supposedly, this was to change things. Now, what's in this report? The LSD experiments are in this report. The idea the Central Intelligence Agency was domestically infiltrating civil rights groups, anti-war groups, people that essentially opposed the government within the United States, which was not part of their mandate, in fact, was illegal. The fact that they were reading people's mail, utilizing unwitting victims in experiments for mind control, all of this came out in this report in 1975. And yet, the CIA continues to do it even to this day. Think about the kinds of activities that have been reported pretty widely over the last few years, whether it's digging through garbage to blackmail other diplomats, which is something our intelligence community does, whether it's to send pallet loads of money into countries like we did in Afghanistan to bribe officials as a way of doing business, or whether it's to assassinate people with drones, kidnap people, and torture them. Now, most of us don't know people like this, but this is the government that I unfortunately have guiding my country right now, is a government of criminals. Now, people want to talk about, oh, this couldn't happen here. It has happened here. It's happened for decades in the United States. And this report by the President's Commission, it touches the very tip of that iceberg. This is another document. This is this guy, Captain Tyler. He later became a colonel and retired. He was involved in pretty much the sort of esoteric side of some of the government research. This book, this chapter out of this book is called Low Intensity Conflict in Modern Technology. It was prepared by Maxwell Air Force Base in 1984. And it was talking about a large variety of technologies. But in this particular one, if you look at sort of the subject lines, stimulation of bone regeneration, healing of fractures, treatment of disease, healing of wounds, you look at behavior modification in animals. And some of these things that are listed here were kind of under the mysterious category. They couldn't really explain what was happening in 1984, but there was the idea was to stimulate research in these fields. So a number of things happened. A lot of money started to flow into these areas. One of the reports that came out in the 1980s as a result of some of this was the Radio Frequency Dosimetry Handbook, which is a big, thick handbook. It was produced by the University of Utah under contract to the United States Air Force to determine the radio frequency dosages that would require to override every vital organ of the human body, whether it be the heart, the liver, the lungs, the kidneys, to sort of preempt their natural function to be able to do it remotely. And the idea was to take that leap of technology and begin to apply it into weapon systems. Mind Control, The Economist cover story. Many people don't remember this one. This is 2002, I believe. Yeah, 2002. And what this cover story was about the ethics of mind control. Not saying, hey, does it exist or doesn't exist, saying it's here right now, and we really need to be debating whether we should advance this technology, whether we should limit this technology. Economist is certainly a credible publication. Not too much happened from this story. This is, unfortunately, it's not showing up. November, you can get this one on my website. I'll give you my website because this is a very important document. This is the Navy set up a new set of regulations for human experiments. It was approved in 2006. In history, that's like tomorrow and yesterday, right? It's like now. And in this, they specifically call out mind control experiments and who has the authority to approve them. And the persons with the authority to approve them is undersecretaries of the Navy in the case of Navy intelligence or naval research. Now, it's not just CIA. Naval intelligence does this work. The Marines have a section on non-lethal weapons that this falls under. The Air Force has the Electromagnetic Directorate, which is working in an area called controlled effects, which deal again with mind control and physiological effects on human beings. In fact, they publish a publication called Technology Horizons. I believe it's the June 2004 issue. You can look it up. The cover story is on controlled effects. Now, what are controlled effects? The first effect is attacking hardware, like equipment, like machines, to be able to interfere with the flow of electrons through circuits to disrupt those ability of those machines to operate. Not using bombs and bullets and the things of history, but using energy itself to manipulate hardware. The second sort of level of controlled effects talked about in that article are the idea of manipulating the software, the systems that run those systems, so that you can disrupt the software, then you disrupt the hardware and things collapse. And the third leg of controlled effects is the human operator. And what they say in this particular article, produced by the Electromagnetic Director of the Air Force, is that we can target or create the illusion of all of the senses in the human body, sight, sound, touch, taste, to give people complete memory sets, complete experiential sets that you wouldn't be able to distinguish the synthetic from the real. Now think about that for a moment. What does that do to court testimony in 20 years if this becomes the norm? They're now talking about using this for post-traumatic stress syndrome folks, people coming back from warfare. Let's just sort of clean out the garbage of the mind and get rid of that stress. Some people think that's a great idea. Personally, I think that's the biggest mistake we could ever make. Because whatever those servicemen and women were engaged in, what used to happen in warfare, what happened in World War II when everybody came back, they said, I don't ever want to see my children in these things. I don't want to see my grandchildren in these things. Wars need to be put down, not amplified. When you take the human factor out of warfare and it becomes like a video game, then our willingness to withdraw from direct conflict no longer happens. And think about where our military science has gone. In fact, I want to mention another very important publication. It was produced by the U.S. Army War College in the early 1980s, and it's called The Revolution of Military Affairs and Conflict Short of War. And this particular paper was talking about revolution of military affairs. What is that exactly? This is a leap as important as the introduction of gunpowder in the Middle Ages in Europe, as important as atomic weapons in the last century. And that's how they characterize it. And what this is the leap where we move from ordnance, from bullets, bombs, things that rip tissue and tear things up, to electromagnetic weapon systems that keep sort of the hardware intact, but debilitate the human operator to the point of being combat ineffective. Or conversely, enhance the possibilities within our own combatants while degrading the abilities of others. And some simple ways that you can achieve this. You can introduce to the battlefield certain elemental compounds that in small background amounts would not be considered dangerous. Let me give you iodine as an example. We all need a certain amount of iodine in the body to maintain thyroid function. But if you have too much iodine, you'll get poisoned. You'll die. You'll get sick. So what can you do? You can send a signal in that resonates at the very same signal strength and frequency as iodine. You can send that signal in, and the body will begin to react as if it's gotten this massive load of iodine and show all the symptoms of iodine poisoning. When you check the thyroid, check the blood, it's not there. Mystery illness. Something as simple as that for manipulating large populations, not necessarily with their consent and not necessarily with clear knowledge, and nothing shows up in the background that would say, wow, this poison actually exists that would account for this. A simple way. One of the other ways that this technology can be exploited is really quite simple. There was an article produced by Perimeters, which is a military publication. Perimeters, you can look it up. It's I believe it was the fall 1998. But you can look up the article name called "The Mind Has No Firewalls." Very important article. This article talked about all the various ways in which you could introduce mind effects or mind control technologies using modern technology today. And the original article was actually written in a military journal called Entier, published in what is now Russia. What's interesting about this is it said you could use any electromagnetic carrier, whether it be radio, TV, the internet, now cell phones, but essentially any of these carriers, you can modulate a signal on them that will manipulate behavior of segments of the population. And the Russians demonstrated this in a couple of different ways. There was a program, it was called Undercurrents. It aired in the CBC, which is a Canadian public broadcasting system. Undercurrents did two really interesting stories that I got to participate in. One was on HAARP and the other was on mind control. And on the mind control story that they did, this is a very popular program in Canada at the time, and this particular segment was their highest rated they had ever run. And they had folks that came in who were involved in the Star Wars initiative during the Reagan administration that couldn't talk about what they did in the White House, but they could talk about what they observed in Russia. And one of the things that they talked about was the idea that you could create sort of this white noise, and on this white noise carry a signal. And so they put out this message, bring us cake. In Russians at tea time, you eat the little cakes. I guess you do that in other parts of Europe as well. And so at the appointed time, they began to broadcast this. And workers from within that building and on the street were bringing cake into the meeting room without really knowing why they were doing it. They just felt like doing it. Well, that was in fact what they were programmed to do. Now this goes back, we're talking about 15-year-old technology. And when you think about sort of where did it go from there, in 2006, there were a couple contracts led by DARPA, which does research for the defense industry in the United States. And DARPA used to be run by a guy named Tony Tether. Tony Tether was a good friend of Ben Eastman's. Now, what they were doing then was they had let two contracts to the University of California for what's called electronic telepathy. Okay? Electronic telepathy, the idea of reading another person's mind at a distance by analyzing the emanations coming from this area, being able to analyze that and determine and interpret what it is. And then the other half of the contract was to create complex signals to see if you could transfer that array, so to speak, of signals into another person's consciousness and whether they would perceive the same images. Now there was work done by Elizabeth Rauscher and her late husband, Bill Weiss, in this very same area. In fact, I have a copy of their unpublished paper where they actually built an electronic circuit where they could take a person in one room and a person in another room, attach this person to that circuit and this person to that circuit, and then the psychic cards where they show the triangles and the squares and the circles and the squiggly lines. 100% accurate, with 9 test subjects who had never experienced, consciously anyway, any sense of extrasensory perceptions or psychic perceptions. They did it with hardware, transferring thoughts from one to another. Now, which tells me it's probably a little more simple than what DARPA is doing. But when Ben Eastman was doing work on HAARP, and he was doing other work for DARPA at the time, and we had talked about him in our first publication, and actually after publication became friends, and Ben Eastman's attitude was, some things just shouldn't be done. And one of the things that he'd been working on was weather modification technologies, which he was at that time, when we first met, making that technology available to the military. And after some dialogue with us and others, he decided there are certain technologies that are not safe in the hands of military. And at one point along the course, I began doing quite a bit of work on this whole mind effects issue, and I caught the attention of a woman, Dorothy Lay. Now, Dorothy is one of the heirs to the Lay, as in Frito-Lay and PepsiCo Corporation. So very wealthy family. Dorothy was very interested in this technology specifically as it applied to victims. And so she approached me at one point and asked if I would become a member of her board of directors for a nonprofit that she was setting up to deal with these kinds of technologies. And I got to think about whether I should tell you the rest of this story, and I think I will, because why not? So I have this same intuition, all of us have it. I used to not pay as much attention to it as I do today. When my intuition tells me something, I listen, because when I really think about it, it's never been wrong. Neither has yours, if you really think about it, or maybe don't think about it, and just start acting on it. So my intuition said, and this was a very difficult time for me in 2002. 2002, I had been betrayed by a very good friend. Economically, was bankrupt in the middle of this work, because I started this work in '94. Economically was being crushed, and at that point was deciding whether I was going to stay in this work at all. And I'm going through a bunch of my files, and I see this file, and it's marked Lay. And I remember this person had contacted us needing some information, and we provided, and we never charged for that. I mean, the way we operated is I sold books, and people like you bought my books, and they allowed me to do this work. I didn't write for grants where somebody could manipulate me and control me and tell me what to say. I didn't go out and find some publisher that would edit out my work. I risked my own money, I published my book, and then I asked people to help me by supporting that work, by buying that book. And I tell you, I made $2.5 million, and I spent that $2.5 million over 20 years doing what I'm doing right now.
Thank you.
And the whole idea was to just educate. I didn't deal with victims, okay? And the reason I didn't is because I felt that that was putting the cart before the horse. We first need to educate people that the technology is real, that this could really happen to people. And from that foundation, and that became the foundation of my work in this. So Dorothy calls me on the phone and she says, "Will you be on my board?" And I talked to her for about an hour. At the end of the hour, I says, "No, I can't be on your board." She said, "Why not?" I said, "Because my intuition is telling me I really can't be on your board." And she goes, "Well, I deserve more than that." I said, "Okay, I don't know your board members. I don't know who your board is, but something in here is saying there's a problem there and I don't want to be associated with them." So it was a couple of months later I got the call back. Because I told her also, I said, "You have means, you have the ability, go research what they say they're doing, go see if it's really being done and find out for yourself. Do your due diligence again." And she did. A couple of months later she came back and she said, "You were right. They were defrauding me in a number of ways. I've cleared out my board. It's just me now and my attorney. Will you be on my board?" Now bear in mind, I'm in a pretty desperate situation economically. At the time I have 5 children at home, got people to take care of, an economy I got to manage. And I tell Dorothy, "No, I can't be on your board." She says, "Well, why not?" I said, "Well, I need to meet you first, in person, eyeball to eyeball." I said, "We're going to talk for 3 days. We're not going to talk about your foundation. I want to know everything I'm ever going to read about you and your family in the newspaper. I want you to have the same knowledge level of me. And I want to know what your worldview is before I join with you in achieving that worldview. Because you have the means, and I have the willingness if that worldview is shared." So we spent a few days. We decided that I could do this, and for 4 years I worked with her, and we put together, as her major effort was, a conference on mind effects. But it wasn't open to the public, it was closed to the public. And it was to bring some key people together to have a conversation that would be open and free. And one of those people I invited was Ben Eastland, who by then I'd gotten to know, had watched what he had done in terms of his career. He was well connected with DARPA at the time. And I called him and I said, Ben, would you consider participating in this conference? And he said, if you had asked me this 7 or 8 years ago on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the relevance and importance of this and 1 being irrelevant and unimportant, I would have given this a 1 or a 2. He goes, every time I talk to Tony Tether or others at DARPA, nobody's laughing about mind control anymore, and it's a 9 or a 10, and yes, I'll participate in your conference. The next person I asked was Garth Nicholson. Does that name ring any bells for anybody? Okay, Garth Nicholson was a full professor, I believe it was Texas A&M. He taught medical students. He taught over 1,000 medical students. He was the guy that blew the whistle on Gulf War syndrome and testified in our Congress 6 times before his wife was fired as a molecular biologist from Texas A&M, and he was tenured. They couldn't fire him, but they definitely harassed him, because he was one of the first courageously enough to step up to the plate and complain about what had been happening in the Gulf War with depleted uranium and some of the other technologies that were being applied there. Well, the best thing that ever happened to him was he got out of the university system. He formed a nonprofit to deal with chronic disease, and he was somebody that I watched maintain his course under really difficult circumstances, and so he was invited to that conference. I invited the daughter of my mentor, Rayo Michaela. She's an electrophysiologist. She serves on one of the boards in Russia that regulates medical applications of lasers. She's an electrophysiologist, quite brilliant. We invited her. We invited Rosalie Bertel. Do anybody remember Rosalie Bertel? Okay, a few. Rosalie is past, also deceased now. She was mathematician, physicist, biologist. She taught higher mathematics to doctoral students at Berkeley. She's also a nun. It's kind of an odd combination. And she was the lead statistician to go into Bhopal for the World Health Organization after that huge chemical disaster. But she was considered one of the top people in the world for dealing with victims of radiological experiments, including electromagnetic radiation. She actually took some of our work and added to it and published a book on the HAARP system and its effect on human beings on this sort of broad scale. So we had invited Rosalie, who'd been through some really difficult times as well, rose out of her own ashes and maintained her ethical platform. The other person we invited was Alexander Keverainen. Does anybody recognize that name? He was the former head of the USSR Academy of Science Biophysics department for 10 years. And this is the area that really gets into the meat of what we're talking about here today. Now, what got Alex, I believe, is deceased now also. All these guys, they're a lot older than me and they keep dying of old age. But Alex got his stimulation in science at a young age, watching a demonstration of the paranormal, ESP, telepathy, these kinds of things in Russia when he was a teenager. And it just really caught his interest. When I met Alex, he was in his 60s and one of the brightest top 5 or 6 biophysicists on the planet, recognized by institutions around the world. And what he had determined is that there were rational reasons for why these things manifested. So he was invited to this conference and actually presented a paper giving the mathematics and the physics that lends itself to these extrasensory possibilities, these things that the military now calls anomalous human capabilities. We used to call it extrasensory perception, or ESP. But now they give it a new name because there's a lot of connotations for that kind of gets you discredited in certain segments of the scientific community. So I want to roll back again a little bit. I want to talk about binaural beat, which I had mentioned earlier in this presentation. And I jump around a little bit. It's kind of my style. I used to not even use these things, but I think people feel more comfortable using them. The binaural beat, we can't hear these really, really low frequency signals because the human ear doesn't quite work that way. Below a certain frequency, the human ear won't hear. Now, a gentleman by the name of Robert Monroe developed a method using binaural beat where you would send in a signal within the range of human hearing, say at 15,000 hertz or pulses per second or cycles per second. Coming in one ear at say 15,000, another signal coming in the other ear at say 15,007. Within the cranium, they will cancel each other out and leave a beat frequency of 7, the difference between the two. 15,000, 15,007. The beat frequency becomes 7 hertz, 7 pulses per second, which happens to be in the upper theta range, and this is where the brain then drives to. But at the same time that occurs, you get a hemispheric balance, a distribution of energy across both hemispheres of the brain. The analytical side and the creative side end up working together. This is actually how human beings are supposed to function. This is how young children predominantly function, with more of a balance between the hemispheres, where the energy is more balanced. And then we educate them. And with young girls, who we say are more intuitive and have this other operation of the brain, and young boys are more analytical, and now we kind of treat everybody the same, so we kind of dumb them down all on the same level. But when you look at young children, and you look at where their brain activity is in between 3 and say 5 or 6 years old, they have this predominant brain frequencies, or a lot of theta brain frequencies coming in, and then some alpha, and then higher frequency ranges. Now, what is theta? Theta states, if we're in a theta state, we're kind of in that dreamlike state between awake and asleep, where you're consciously aware of your dreams. This is where 3 to 5-year-olds spend a good deal of the time. Why their imaginations, as we call it, are so active. And we keep saying, oh, don't pay attention to that, don't pay attention to that, which is our first attempt to shut down the intuitive combinations of the way the brain is actually supposed to work. In fact, for those who have a Christian background, Jesus Christ himself said, look at the little children, watch what they do. I think I heard somebody say something about this earlier. Little children come to the table kind of innocent, with a view of the world that's quite different than the rest of ours, but the brain activity of children is unique, and we begin to take that out of them in the structure of the way we educate. So what Robert Monroe, he was actually a radio engineer. He owned a bunch of radio stations. He had this really weird experience. It's an OBE, an out-of-body experience that he had that kind of threw him, didn't make any sense to him. So he also noticed that in the background there was this kind of noise that he perceived. So he began to experiment, and he created this technique for binaural beat. He developed a whole series. In fact, he actually got US patents on a binaural beat. This is an image taken out of one of those US patents from 1994. And this is showing the brain before the activity, before turning on the hemisync. And this is after, showing a more even distribution and a more rhythmic pattern in the brain waves, as you see up in the upper right-hand corner. Let me roll back again so you can kind of see the comparison. Normal brain, kind of disorganized activities happening all through the brain, and then a coherent signal creating a hemispheric balance and an optimization of brain potential. So what did he do with this? He developed a whole series of things, audio input technology, essentially to manipulate behavior, but where you're in control of that manipulation. So you want to quit smoking, you get his CD on quit smoking. It affects the brain in such a way, becomes compelling, very effective. Sleep disorders can be addressed in this way to have someone be able to relax. Meditation, concentration, accelerated learning, a whole array of things can be done. And they did this by working with, over the course of many years, and now his daughter doing the work of working with thousands of people to determine which signals actually created which effects, and then developing technology that they could place in the hands of individuals to make the choice on how to use. Now, that's kind of an interesting way of looking at technology. It was my area of interest beginning all of this work, was not looking at sort of the dark side of all this, but in the mid-'80s I got very interested in light and sound stimulation of the brain that capitalized on sound signals and flickering light for brain entrainment. Entraining the brain where the brain will follow that external signal, or what's called FFR, frequency following response. So very little energy. Let me roll back to Delgado again. 1/50th the amount of energy that the Earth creates is sufficient to move your brain into very specific states, dialing that radio up, if you will. This is just another technique for altering brain activity that might be beneficial, but you're in control of it, not somebody else. I'm going to skip some of these images because they're not so relevant. And I'm going to close the images, and let me just go back into the whole dialogue of this mind effects. When I think about sort of where do we go with this conference, when we put that conference together with the Lay Institute, our purpose was to bring together these really good thinkers to try and see if we could create a synergy between them. And when I first got interested in doing something actively in science, it wasn't about HAARP and it wasn't about mind control. The role that I thought I would play, and I was working in a government office at the time, and it was, my friend said, you make your living with your left foot, because I could make my living, but the rest of my creativity could be engaged elsewhere. And me working in a bureaucracy was really a bad match. But the point was, my youngest son, when I was getting very frustrated in that work, said, change channels. Now I'm thinking about this, because I had just given him this discussion about creativity was like changing the channels on a TV set, right? And so he's feeding me back, time to change channels, Dad. So I thought about it, and what I decided I would do is I read independently in science for over 20 years. I had read some really compelling things from, say, one guy in one branch of science. So I thought, boy, if this person could ever meet that person, you could really see something happen. And the first paper I actually ever presented in science, I was 19, and it was at another obscure conference that I ended up in on biorhythm research. And my paper was contrasting, at that time, the Soviet method of research versus the US method. Now, the US method was compartmentalization, separate, distill things down to the smallest subspecialty and then push these people into a corner and let them do this bit of the research. And then you got 9 other people over here and 10 other groups over there and 15 groups over there, and somewhere all this stuff comes together and it's really sloppy. Okay, it's sloppy because there's a lot of repetition, it's very expensive. Now the Russians, Soviets at the time, they didn't have the money for that kind of research to spread it out that way, and they used a very different method. They took experts from all these different fields, even though they didn't seem like they should connect. They put them in the same room to work together, to develop science. That's why, when you look at the exposures that we had seen earlier, what are the regulatory exposures of electromagnetic fields? The Russians in the 90s and the 80s were 1,000 times more stringent than they were in the US. Well, why was it? Because they had actually made the observations that we hadn't made and actually connected the dots in a way that say, hey, this is dangerous. Now that doesn't mean they followed their own regulation, because they probably didn't. They did whatever was expeditious there, but at least they recognized the physiological responses to electromagnetic fields and the fact that you could manipulate them. What was discovered by a guy named Alan Fry, he was looking at microwave, and he discovered that there's this kind of clicking effect. But it only occurred when you pulse modulated the signal. And if you look at, I heard earlier, it's always scalars. It's always scalars. It's not vectors. It's not electromagnetic fields as we think about them. But if you look at the ones that affect human psychology and physiology, if you look at those signals, they have a very quick rise time and a very fast drop. They're like the punch. Like punching that ionosphere to create the ELF, it's like those signals, those modulations on these other carriers are meant to trigger that effect by you in training to that pulse, that firing, or some submodulation being carried on a general carrier. Now, if you remember the first Gulf War, the first Bush War, and you remember how the Iraqi army just sort of gave up, the 4th largest army in the world, just like school children on their first fire drill, throwing their hands up and surrendering, thousands of guys to a few dozen. What was that about? Now, I speculated on this, and then it was Scottish media that later reported on this and said it was Project Solo, which was a project operated by the United States. And what we did is we had this C-130 flying over the country at the time. And it was taking and piggybacking a signal on the radio broadcast going into the region that were broadcasting the Muslim music and prayers. So all these guys are in their bunkers listening to their favorite radio station. Unbeknownst to them, the subsignals being laid on that broadcast created anxiety, high levels of anxiety and fear. And then you watch this army just collapse under this. And that was kind of in my view, the first mass test of could you really do this? Could you do it in this adversarial environment? And one of my friends joked, hey, it's the perfect Republican weapon, right? You can keep all the hardware in place, but totally wipe out the population. Zbigniew Brzezinski said in Between Two Ages, it wouldn't matter whether it's liberals or conservatives. They just use different rationale for accomplishing their political ends. On the conservative side, the neocon side, it might be the fascination with gadgetry and new technology, as Zbigniew Brzezinski said. And on the liberal side, it might be the idea that we're doing this for your own good. The government is here, right? And we've all heard that before. The fact of the matter is, when you start thinking about mind control technologies as a concept, the idea that someone believes that they can interfere with your free will, this is something that most religions in the world say God won't even do. Yet, men think this is their appropriate direction in technology to interfere with the way consciousness flows. Now think about, for a moment, what is the easiest way to manipulate consciousness? The easiest way, the simplest way, create an environment of anxiety and fear. Because what happens at that point is you cannot reach your higher states of consciousness. If you look at Monroe's rhythmic patterns in the hemisync as an example, higher states of consciousness are associated with those rhythmic patterns within the brain, not that incoherent scattering of data and information and energy. So if you create a certain environment of fear and anxiety and you look at an EEG monitoring brain activity of an individual, you see this kind of scattered patterns. When a person is experiencing higher emotions, love, compassion, you begin to see rhythmic patterns. Another simple way of seeing it is something you can actually measure. Take two people that are in love and they, the saying, and I looked into her eyes, right? If you actually gaze into the eyes of another individual and hold that gaze, you'll begin to mirror each other's brain activity in a pretty unique way. Your breathing will even synchronize if you do it long enough. Two people's breathing begin to synchronize, or energy fields begin to synchronize. And at the same time, their awareness, their intuitions elevate. And their rhythmic patterns in the brain can be seen. If you can create an environment of fear, think about the advertising you see on television. It's all about how you smell, how your breath is, It's all these things to make you uncomfortable. You think about the 6 o'clock news. Now, we heard someone talking about the 6 o'clock news and how that kind of works. You come home from a hard day at work. Most people sit down in front of the television set. They're already fatigued. They begin to watch the television. And then their spouse hollers, it's time for dinner. It's time for dinner. How many of you have been there, right? Nobody's listening. No one's hearing. Because they're in a light trance-like state. Now, if you look in a dark room, television is here. Look behind you at the white wall and look at the flicker rate. If that flicker rate is a coherent signal within a certain range, through the optic nerves, your brain will lock onto that signal. If you monitor the brain activity at that time, you'll drop into this highly suggestive state. And now you listen to the advertising. Now, every school of psychology teaches frequency following response today, and that you can create these kinds of effects. Would they apply it in advertising? Of course they would. That's why advertising works so well. It works because it's convincing and compelling. When you look at the 6 o'clock news, would somebody utilize that in broadcasting the news or the latest propaganda from whatever source it's coming from? I would speculate. Today I would speculate and say yes. When you think about how simple it is to create that agitation. It was Persinger at Laurentian University published a paper in 1995 talking about this whole concept. And what he said back then was, you could create a complex signal, broadcast it out over a large area that just created the sense of something's not right, dis-ease. And then you go watch the 6 o'clock news and they indict some specific ethnic group, maybe it's Muslims. And then a certain amount of that anger gets diverted that way. Well, in a day where lots of things are decided on the razor edge of populations, on majorities, this is a very, very powerful tool, and one quite simple to apply in the modern world. When you think about news feeds today, how much is really investigative reporting and how much of it is just spitting out somebody's press release, right? Very little investigative reporting today because it's expensive, because it's not immediate. And when you look at the news media today, it's almost immediate. And most of it is just meant to entertain. It's not meant to inform. You know, freedom of the press, it used to have something to do with keeping an informed public so we could make good decisions and we could govern as a public. Today we debate the media as freedom of speech. Say whatever you want, say however you want, but nobody takes responsibility, and we have the neutered, neutral news. And if you really believe it's neutral, come on. Everybody who assigns a story to a reporter knows that reporter's bias. The editors have bias. It comes out in the news and what gets published and what doesn't. How many stories about mind control hit the news? Occasionally, The Economist might pick it up. Somebody might pick up a little bit and piece of it. But no one has really taken it on as a topic and consistently pursued it. Yet, when you think about modern technology and the resolution, now we've been talking about things that have happened in the past, and something you even mentioned is MK Ultra as a program you've heard it alluded to. That was the CIA's program, had 144 sub-projects under it. Most of the records surrounding that were shredded by a guy named Gottlieb, who was responsible for that at the Central Intelligence Agency during the Church Committee hearings. We never really got the truth back then. But the resolution, the ability to do this has become increasingly refined as our technology has advanced. When you think about technological advances, one of the things I read says that technology from the invention of the wheel to where we are today doubles about every 9 to 10 months. Wow, think about it. Invention of the wheel to where we are today, 10 months from now we're going to double it. And then we're going to keep doing that. It used to be every 5 years in the 1980s, and it kept shrinking as our computing power increased and our ability to manipulate large amounts of data increased. Now a supercomputer, you think about supercomputers, will do somewhere when I was originally doing this work, about 280 teraflops a second, which at that time would be like 6 billion people on the planet with hand calculators doing a calculation every 60 seconds for 60 hours. To do what that supercomputer could do in a second. Well, the next evolution, some think it's already here, are quantum computers. What does a quantum computer do? Quantum computer in 1 hour will do what a supercomputer does in 1 trillion years. Gets back to this analogy of how much EMF do you have out there? Well, think about the same kind of amplification and computing power. You look at privacy as a concept. It doesn't exist in the world today, right? Virtually everything about us is cataloged, tracked, whether it's your GPS on your phone, whether it's your phone conversations. In the United States, every piece of mail is photographed for who it went to and who sent it. When you think about your telecommunications, your internet connections, Google, AT&T, Verizon, all of them have violated the very essence of what personal privacy is all about. Because today in the 21st century, we need a revolution and evolution of what privacy is all about. Because you, experiencing the victimization of this technology, are the pinnacle of the abuse. But everyone is subject to abuse of personal privacy. You should think about it. It would start and end at our physical doorway to our home. It has nothing in your home compared to what is in data banks stored on every single human being in this room. Now, people say, oh, don't worry about it. We don't have the ability to collect it. We don't have the resolution to look into it. Quantum computers will give that resolution. Whichever government finds quantum computing first will be able to hack through every security code for every system on the planet within hours. They'll be able to predict with so much accuracy by collecting all that data and analyzing that data, it'll almost seem a spiritual event. But it'll only be accurate up to a certain point. And then there'll be a little bit of flaw. And over time, that flaw will amplify to where it's big flaws. But we'll rely increasingly on these systems to guide our world, to guide our ideas, our philosophy, and how we pursue the world. The internet, when people think about that as the worldwide mind of the 21st century, PBS, our public broadcasting system, did a special called the Worldwide Mind. And they say within 100 years, and I say within 20 years, or even now, maybe it already exists now, but within 20 years, that you'll be able to connect the physical minds of all of the people on the planet in a worldwide mind. Now that might appeal to some. It doesn't really appeal to me from the standpoint of technology. I think we already have that on a certain level. I think we already are connected on a certain level. Our belief systems limit our ability to access that level, but I believe it's here. And I've seen enough demonstration of it. You know, all those scientists I had in that room for that Mind Effects conference, the part that really blew me away, that I didn't expect, was what they really centered on was the idea, and this was Rosalie Bertell, the nun and physicist, and she said, the next leap is going to be the leap where we realize or we recognize or we remember our extrasensory perceptions, our anomalous capabilities as human beings. And that becomes the next evolution of humankind. And what suppresses that is fear and anxiety, because you cannot reach those states of consciousness as long as you're in fear and anxiety. And anyone who purports or is a victim of these technologies, do you have anxiety? Do you have fear? Of course you do. Do you have the ability to reach those higher states of consciousness in that condition? It's physiologically not possible. So when you think about entire populations, it's whether it's religion injecting fear, or whether it's government injecting fear, or as my friend used to say, you know, the king keeps you poor and the church keeps you dumb, kind of was the early idea, if you think about how things evolved in Europe several hundred years ago. When you think about modern technology on the backdrop of that concept, what's changed? Nothing's changed. It's just the same deal. You know, 6,000 wars in 4,000 years, most of them over religion. Let me give you a clue. God doesn't need any help killing anybody. God can probably do it himself or herself. The fact of the matter is, the idea that people would just be evil and I think I heard earlier today that the psychopaths are in the minority. I believe they are. I think really evil to the core people, they're out there, but they're not this mass. Most people do things because they believe they're right. And then they want to impose their rightness on other people. And this is kind of the mistake, and then we end up in this conflict between ideas without being fair and recognizing people's right to disagree. And I heard it said earlier, certain things you can't say in Germany. Certain things you can't say in a movie theater too. You know, you can't yell fire. Now that makes good sense. You don't want to yell fire in a movie theater. Some would say what we're doing here is yelling fire in a movie theater because we're letting people know what we know, what we've concluded from a good deal of research. You know, my books are written, every page, at the bottom of each page are the footnotes. Some people find that distracting. Personally, I want to know where the information came from as I'm reading it, not a week later as I'm contemplating it. I want to know the source. And so in the publications that I've written, 1,600 source documents were used out of a matrix of 100,000 that we had available to us, more or less. 20,000 that made it into my archives, and 1,600 that made it into 4 books on technology dealing with mind effects, dealing with HAARP, dealing with personal privacy issues. A lot of the things Snowden released in the last few years. You can look at my publications from 1999 and 2000 and you'll see the same things, because the open literature showed enough to come to those conclusions. When I testified in the European Parliament in the 90s at their invitation, and this was a good side story for the technology. A gentleman by the name of Thomas Spencer, he's from the UK, he's a parliamentarian at the time, and he was the chairman of the environmental subcommittee of the European Parliament. And he had contacted me, and somebody had given him the book on HAARP, and he was very interested in this. So we had a conversation, and at my expense, I flew to Brussels and spent a few days with him talking about the issue, and brought with me a couple feet of unclassified documents for his research team to take a look at. What happened then is he moved in the European Parliament. He was a conservative, by the way, and he moved into a foreign affairs chairman. Very powerful position, ideal position for dealing with the things that we were dealing with at the time. So at his invitation, I came over to testify in front of the group on security and disarmament in the European Parliament on HAARP and on non-lethal weapons, the kinds of things we've been talking about today, the manipulation of human beings. Now, they do it a lot differently than we do in the US. In the US, when you have public hearings, the public actually gets to come. In the European Parliament, the public meeting is you have to have an invitation to come. So that's kind of different. I hadn't really thought much about that. And they can also do things behind closed doors, which we theoretically can't do in the United States. You can't have a meeting without the public invited or the media invited. So what happened the night before the hearing? The committee met with myself, one of the other people testifying, and a member of the press, and we spent 5.5 hours on a non-official meeting to talk about these issues, so that when we actually gave our testimony the following day, they would have formulated a set of questions to give us the opportunity to follow on. So it was a great way to do it, because then they were at least had a good base of knowledge. Now, in that private meeting, we demonstrated a technology using infrasound, where you could transfer sound through electrodes attached to the skin, where you would perceive that proverbial voice in the head. And we were able to demonstrate that to parliamentarians in that closed session. And then we went into the hearing the following day, and it was Rosalie Bertel, which is where I met her, testifying on our side. It was, I can't remember the gentleman's name, but he was from a group called GRIP in Brussels that does research on weapon systems particularly, and he had done his master's thesis on HAARP. And so he was there. We had someone from the International Red Cross that had done work on non-lethal weapons and was a specialist in this particular area, and then I was there. We each got 15 minutes to present, and then I got an hour of questions from the committee in the open hearing, where I had the opportunity to talk about some of these things. And right around that time, there had been this incident in Japan where children watching a cartoon that had a certain flicker rate had caused over 700 children to go to the hospital with epileptic seizures. Now remember, non-ionizing radiation is not a problem, right? The flicker of a TV caused 700 kids to go into the hospital. Now some say that was by design, some say that was by accident, but it was a perfect illustration for talking about non-ionizing radiation in the European Parliament, because they had all read that story. It was fresh. The other thing demonstrating infrasound, something that had never been demonstrated to my knowledge in that type of a meeting, to show that you could actually transfer sound without necessarily involving the ears. Now there's another technology that was advanced by a guy named Woody Norris, and he won the Lemelson Prize at MIT for this particular technology, and I believe the year was 2004, but you can look up Woody Norris. And his was using acoustic heterodyning, where he could send in two signals from two different sources, point them at an individual in the crowd, and they would hear this voice in their head that nobody else would hear. Well, he won $500,000 for that prize, organized a company called ADCO, you can look them up, they're a public company, and he sold that technology to the military for perimeter protection, where they could have these sort of alarm systems. So when the protesters got too close, they'd hear these warning signs that nobody else was hearing. Now you think about that for a moment. Imagine, this is why the European Parliament got interested, because we use this illustration. Now imagine a national leader standing up in front of a group, all of a sudden hear voices in their head that nobody else hears. That's the end of that guy, right? I mean, he's out of there. And that's exactly what that technology can do. And that was one demonstration of it. Some have said that you could pulse modulate a signal on a single beam and it would create the same effect, or utilize something like HAARP, not so much for voice in the head, but for certainly changing emotional state of large segments of the population. When we looked at all of this, we even looked back, where else could this have been used? And there was a device in Vietnam called the LIDA machine, L-I-D-A. A guy who researched this was a guy named Ross Addy, who is unfortunately also deceased. Ross Addy was brilliant and was utilized by government, by private sector as an expert in these kinds of areas. Well, he was asked to look at this particular device that had been captured during the Vietnam War. It was a Russian device, and it created the entrainment effect using flickering light and sound. And they used it for interrogating prisoners by putting them into that light trance-like state and then extracting intelligence from them. Now that's the 1960s again. This is low resolution, low technology. As computing power has increased, as our knowledge of human physiology has increased, as our knowledge of the electromagnetic nature of human beings has increased, the ability to manipulate large segments of the population becomes easily achieved, either as a side effect or unfortunate disaster of our technology. I used to mention Swiss Reinsurance. Swiss Reinsurance wrote a paper on electrosmog, I believe it was 2002, and they said to the insurance industry then, in this report, don't insure electromagnetic field effects because it'll result in a bigger lawsuit than Firestone on their tires or the smoking industry. Because the knowledge is here now, and nobody insures that risk. Lloyd's of London insures anything, but they won't insure that risk. Nobody does. Because insurance companies don't like to lose money. It's as simple as that. And yet, the telecom industry on cell phones, before cell phones were invented, the University of Washington had investigated those very same frequencies on chick embryo studies and determined they were harmful. Cell phones didn't exist then. Then cell phones come out and everything's safe all of a sudden. That same guy that did that research would say, wait a minute, we did all this research. This is a dangerous thing. But the telecom industry is a powerful adversary. So it went to the Congress. You remember this. There was a guy in Florida, brain cancer, big controversy, ended up in the Congress. Congress said, we need a study. So the industry said, oh, we'll pay for the study. They spent $25 million on the study. I can't remember the guy's name who did it. But he eventually published a book because his findings were, hey, this is dangerous, all right? He issues his report. They figure, hey, they got him, you know, they got the 25 million into his queue. He got to spend it on all these projects. He made some money himself. Hey, he's our man. Well, he wasn't. This guy actually had some integrity, and I apologize for not recalling his name because I'm usually pretty good. Which one is it? George Carlitz, that's correct. And he wrote a book called Cell Phones, very important book. And when it comes to children, one of his observations had the simple observation of skull thickness. You know, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, 400% more energy transfers through the skull into the brain than an adult. 10-year-old, 12-year-old, approximately 200%. This is one of the main reasons why you don't want children using cell phones, or even worse, the portable phone in the home, because it's even less efficient with the battery and the energy, and there's even more leakage. And what do? Try and find a hardline phone today where you actually pick it up and talk into it. You can't even find them anymore. They're almost impossible to find. When you look at what we have learned about human physiology and the effects of electromagnetic fields on the human physiology, it is the revolution in science that will collapse the pharmaceutical industry one day. And one day we're going to wake up and recognize that the sea in the soup of electromagnetic radiation has been the cause and the root to most of the chronic disease we see on the planet today. When you combine that with that concept that I used, that example of iodine, everyone has a little bit, now you have these complex interactions, 5,000 new chemicals introduced or compounds introduced to the public every year without really any serious studies, and then you add this on top of it, and now you have a very toxic world. And then you take the technology of manipulation from the propaganda of World War II to the downloading of data. What does the military hope to achieve? They want to be able to train military personnel with a download. Blah! There's your 12 years worth of education. Now let's go on, and now here's the thing. Think about that kind of education. No critical thinking involved, just programming. like writing to a disk. No critical thinking involved. Who controls that curriculum controls the way in which our society goes. This is the risk. What about evidence in courtrooms when you can create a synthetic memory or wipe one out? What does that do to a democratic republic or a democracy where people have the power? That power has been taken from us as we become increasingly transparent to governmental agencies and they become increasingly opaque. It is the opposite of what should be occurring. There shouldn't be a camera in every household. There should be a camera in every government office. Because the technology is there, we should be able to dial in and look at what our employees are doing, right? Wouldn't you like to be able to dial up your congressional office and see that conversation they're having in real time? And why shouldn't we be able to do that? What do they have to hide? You know, you think about government, and you start saying that, and you know the only people protected from that kind of intrusion in the U.S. are federal employees. They have a higher level of protection than the average citizen within the country that I live in. For what? And when you think about government, everyone points to the politician. I can tell you most politicians are ignorant. In fact, most political parties in the United States, the preference is to have people they look like the news announcer, but they couldn't think their way out of a phone booth, right? We don't even have a phone booth anymore, but they couldn't think their way out of one. Because they want people that are smart enough to look good, but not smart enough to think on their own. That's the ideal politician for political parties. Because they can be told what to do. Look at how much money is being spent in political outcomes. Huge amounts of money. Some people have pointed and looked at, like Australia, to mandatory voting. Everybody votes now. Worst possible thing that you could ever do. And here's why. When the population doesn't vote, who pulls the lever? Those that are informed, right? So maybe 20% of the population votes, but at least they're informed. They've educated themselves. You force people to vote to keep their driver's license or medical benefits or whatever social programs you've got running, and you say you will vote. Now who decides what they vote on? Whoever can buy the 30-second or 1-minute ad on TV that influences them the moment they walk into the booth and go, pull the lever. Now we have a dangerous situation, a very dangerous situation. Democracy is something that each of us have to claim internally. The change that people are looking for in this group happens by a change in consciousness, by us recognizing what we are as human beings, recognizing the potential that we have, because you know what these government programs yielded? Everybody points to the fear side of the equation, but what they really discovered was that every single soul, every human being has this anomalous capability. Now imagine if we could awaken those capabilities. Could you hide anything? I mean, if people could literally look into the mind of another person, that makes a politician pretty vulnerable, wouldn't it? And that is the next evolution that I believe is happening, and it's the only evolution, the only revolution that can change the way things are. It starts with human consciousness. It starts with what we believe to be right and true and beginning to act on it. Not from a foundation of fear, but a foundation of confidence. You know, somebody asked me once, what do you think about faith? I said, faith is what you know to be right and true, and you step into it on the idea that you can achieve it. You believe it. So many people I've seen in this work, they keep jumping into things beyond their belief. They don't believe they can achieve it. They try it anyway, and they fail. And they keep failing. And people who are doing good work otherwise, step back, do what you can do with confidence, do what you can do with knowledge. Don't wait for a group to form. The group's already here. It's called the human race. Act on what you know to be right and true. If you make a mistake, clean it up, learn from it, and move forward. When you look across this room, and you look at all these folks with a little bit of gray hair, and you got the gray hair not by all those great things that happened in your life, but by the real disasters that happened in your life. You know, you think about bad news as a stimulation for good news. People ask me, you know, your father's disappearance disappeared off the face of the earth. That must have been a horrible thing. Yeah, it was at the time. I consider it the most important event in my life because it altered my course. The worst things in our lives alter our course. change our direction, activate that higher potential that caused us to rise out of the ashes of our apathy and our defeats and stand on our feet again and move forward. The pain that people experience today is the catalyst for the solutions tomorrow, whether we like it or not, whether it's falling down as a 2-year-old or standing up as an adult. If we stand up on the basis of our ethics, on the basis of our values, and we reinvigorate and let go of the fear and recognize what we are as created beings, we have the potential to make change. And with that, I'll open it to questions. You got a question first.
Yes. Is there a bunker that we can actually go to prove that this disappears because it's sheltered from a satellite signal?
So what you're asking me is, and because I'm having trouble hearing you, you're asking me, is there a way to shield from this?
Well, I mean, we believe that we're being targeted by a satellite signal.
Okay.
So is there a bunker that we could go to that is sheltered from satellite signals?
Not that I'm aware of. And here's what I do know is because you can use any number of carriers to carry a signal in. If you were trying to safeguard, in terms of creating something that would safeguard you from every possible source, I don't think that's economically possible for most people. I mean, because you think about the power grid itself can be modulated. So what, you're going to cut yourself off from everything? That is not the way human beings are meant to live. The only real solution is activate what's possible, reclaim our democracies, throw these guys out, put them in jail where they belong, take the laws away that exempt these people from prosecution and make them accountable. We look at even corporations. We can criminally indict a corporation, and they have freedom of speech. They have no soul, but they can live forever as long as you pay their fees. They have eternal life on earth, something we don't have on earth. The only real solution is you make people accountable. You start throwing people in jail. When corporations violate the law, you don't criminally indict a corporation, you indict their board and put them in prison. Do it a couple of times, and you'll see a much more responsible corporate world. Throw governments in prison, create whistleblower mechanisms, recognize the Snowdens as the world as the heroes on the planet, and we need more of them, not less of them. That's the only way that we make it happen.
Not of living in them, but of just proving that that is the source of this harassment.
Well, I mean, as a source, could satellites be a source? Of course. Any of these technologies can. There's enough evidence in the open literature. I wrote a book called Controlling the Human Mind. For those who speak German, it's in German. It's in Japanese now also. I think 8 or 9 languages now. 250 footnoted sources. That's the evidence that people need. These aren't conversations in some phone booth with somebody. These are academic papers, mainstream media reports, government reports, the things that you can hang meat on. Take those kinds of bits of information. My website at earthpulse.com, hundreds of pages of data, it's free. There's citation after citation. Take the information, pass it on to people that make policy. Those are the ways that you can incrementally make a change. And that information is free. So good data, that's how it happened in the European Parliament. They passed a resolution, the most important resolution on disarmament that they ever passed. And in that is one section that we got in, calling for international treaty dialogue and a ban on any weapons that would manipulate human beings. And that was because of our testimony, what we were able to present. It's a step in the right direction. Not a lot has happened from it, but we need a lot of those steps. We did it as a majority of 1 or 2 people in a remote place in Alaska, relying on thousands of people around the world to do a little bit, and it got us there. It can happen. Take the step in front of you that you know you can achieve, After a number of years, you'll look back at a path you followed that you would have never predicted for yourself. Do what you can do, what you know with confidence you can do. Take those steps. Don't do what you can't win. Win each step along the way. People will come with you. Don't wait for the group to form. Trust that there's other people doing the same. We're all over the planet. We're all over the planet. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know that your kind of movement sometimes also is controlled by mind control?
Possible, I suppose. I think there's always that possibility. I've been in this work 20 years. I've stepped out of it a few times, not in frustration, but just because I've had to survive through a lot of tough times. I don't have that issue so much anymore. I'm able to do pretty much what I want. Yeah, I suppose that could be the case. You do the best you can. I don't think I'm mind controlled, except by my own consciousness at this point in life. Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you very much for your speech. I would like to make you two questions. First question is, states are well known for all the civil freedom movements. I don't know if victims can find a lot of comfort in the awareness and the documentation. I would like to know if there is some groups, organized groups, or technical or species or formal official researchers trying to find practical solutions to detect implants, to show the attacks and all the harassment. And also the second question, because you are politically well connected, I would like to know if other states in the United States are going to follow the example of the 3 or 4 states, Michigan, Missouri, that have signed laws forbidding technologies that affect the human nervous system.
In terms of regulation, I think actually we heard about the bio initiative here, and Cindy Sage, who had kept me informed on that back just prior to its release and as it was being released. These are the tools that I'm talking about. These are what convinced legislators. When we were dealing with the HAARP issue, we had hearings in our state, and what happened at the time, Senator Stevens, who was a very powerful U.S. Senator, told the committee chairman, "You're not having another hearing, or you're not having a political career." And that was kind of the end of her. My brother went on to boot Stevens out of office and take his seat in the U.S. Senate. But as a freshman, there was not much he can do. You don't have very much power as a freshman the way our Congress is configured. And then he just lost his last election by 3,000 votes. And as a Democrat in a Republican state, the fact that he beat one of the longest serving Republicans in history was tough enough. I think you can do it at the local level. Even we saw in the little clip of knocking a cell tower over in Ireland. Each small step aggregates into something larger. I think these steps are important steps to take. Starting at the top usually doesn't work. You have to educate the population. You can then educate policymakers, and then hopefully you can make some change. Ultimately, I think we're going to face my brother as he went out of the Senate. His conclusion was you can't get anything done there. I mean, if he were to run again, it wouldn't be for the U.S. Senate. He wants to actually get something done. And I think we can say that about a lot of our governments in the world today. Nothing's getting done there. The next revolution, and I hope it is not a violent one, the next revolution is going to throw a lot of people out because people are getting tired. People are worn down. And when things get really tough, and it's 1 minute to midnight is usually when Americans wake up, Europeans at least apply the precautionary principle a little bit more, so they wake up maybe 10 minutes before midnight. People are waking up. There is a possibility of change. Yes, ma'am.
I've been a victim and mind control manipulated for a very long time. I'm trying to find a solution to this issue, just like another 11 million Greeks, because Greece has been targeted for more than 10 years without knowing, because we've been always concerned about our health state because of the use of these non-lethal weapons, as they call them, and that's the reason why I came here. And we just realized the last 5 years how that the problem became very intense. And you have seen all over the news what happened in Greece. And I have to tell you, as an inside testimony, that things were really, really bad. I personally had 2 friends who committed suicide. Usually they were very young people. We had people who lost their jobs, they became homeless, they had a lot of diseases, they had cancers, they had all sorts of problems. And nobody really knew what was going on. Even in the parliament, online, on real time, on TV, you could see people not being able to talk. The representatives. So we are very sure anymore, because of what they have published about the ELF, about electromagnetic fields, I don't know the terminology very good, excuse me, about the HAARP, that we have been severely manipulated. Nevertheless, we managed to overthrow the government that was suppressing us so badly, or at least that's what we managed to do. To vote no, to vote against them, to take action. So do you really think that if we team up with other people, we cannot defeat them? That's the reason why I refuse to go into the
question.
This is not a question. You're not an expert.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I just wanted to say, what do you feel about this attack on democracy and on the ancient Greek and current Greek culture?
Without knowing specific, because I've always leaned on the literature, to prove what I have to say. And it's why I'm still standing in front of groups 20 years later. So I don't have specific information on what's happening in Greece, but I can say generally, this is happening everywhere in the populations. And if you look at the results of this, bad government is not just in Greece, it's everywhere. I talk about my government starting this presentation.
About democracy, the question.
That is it. And democracy is not for the corporations, by the corporations, and of the corporations. It's people. It starts with our own consciousness. It starts with our own activity. The Greeks are in the streets. You're going to see the French in the streets. You're going to see people in the streets. And when we heard about the majority, the consumer causing the change, that's where that change will happen. I think we're just seeing the beginnings of it. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and I also add that people should really feel optimistic. As you said, every small step, even the smallest, is important. But I have a specific question because I tried to take down notes here. Did you say that it was in the Gulf War that they sent the C-130 in and it projected? Was it a high frequency wave or?
It was a signal that they could piggyback on the radio broadcast.
Oh, I see. In the frequency modulated range, or?
Yes.
Yeah, and that created fear, right?
Yes.
Then, why didn't you do that in Afghanistan or in Syria or elsewhere?
I couldn't answer that. I just know what the Scottish media reported, and I'm.
Towards in Afghanistan, and we are American soldiers. No, in Iraq. They came out of Iraq, and the soldiers would speak about how they needed to mount on the houses in Baghdad.
Maybe we can go to the next question.
I want to comment on the one other point, which is the small things, because I don't believe in small things, all right, at all. I don't believe in them at all, because simple things, and I used the illustration recently in a conversation, and it was, you're walking down the street, and you walk past a guy, and you smile at him, and grant them some recognition of their humanity in a real way, and maybe that person was on their way to commit suicide, and you stopped them. And then instead they went on and got the cure for MS. Now who got the cure for MS? The guy that rendered the smile that saved that man's life, or the guy that invented the cure? I say they were equal. It was a case of human kindness. human consideration that triggered the change. That's what creates all changes. Every revolution that ever happened on this planet started with one or two people seeing things just a little differently. And that creates the change. All of us have the capability of being the trigger for that next revolution. I'll take one more question.
I heard recently they changed who is in charge of HAARP in Alaska, Daytona.
Yeah.
Is it not longer the military? Who is it?
This is interesting. First they said 2 years ago they were going to shut it all down. And I was interviewed and I said, no, they're not going to shut it down. And so then they shifted it over to DARPA. Okay, and DARPA funded it for the next year. And then they said, okay, DARPA's shutting it down. I have another press release. And I was interviewed again and I said, no, they're not going to shut it down. And so they turned it over to the academics who now get government grants to run it. So all they've done is defer the front end to the University of Alaska and the Geophysical Institute, which originally was where it started. And the Navy and the Air Force were their partners, and then it shifted to Air Force and Navy, and then it shifted to DARPA, and now it shifted back to the academics. But look at where their funding comes from, and it all comes from governmental agencies from around the world doing very specific research. All they did is shuffle the deck because we never backed off, and what they expected from us was what normally happens in these controversies. They rise up for a couple of months and they disappear. Well, I'm still standing 20 years later, and they're still just as uncomfortable running their program. So, you know, stay the course, and at least you press them down just a bit. This gentleman, I know he wanted to ask me one. I keep ignoring you, I don't mean to, so I'll take that.
You know, my question is, before we stop these things, we need to prove it first that the world is existing. Now the problem is in the world, they don't believe us, what's happening. For example, me and other 24 Ethiopians, which is happening this by Ethiopian gang, which is a little gang group. If Ethiopian gang group have access to this technology, how can we, all of these educated people, I'm just simple man, can prove it to the world that these things existing?
Well, I mean, I think it's incremental. I mean, we did it in the European Parliament, proved the technology exists to the satisfaction of parliamentarians. I can tell you, they're the most skeptical of all because they have political risk associated with making statements that you can control the mind of other human beings. Political risk. They're willing to take it when the evidence is presented. We saw it there. We can see it in other places as well. The Russian Duma took it on. Now, those two legislators from the Russian Duma that authored that, they heard my presentation in front of a group called GLOBE in Brussels, which is 44 governments' top environmental legislators. They took that information, they took the documents we provided, went back, got something through the Duma. So you can do it. You do it incrementally. Everybody, again, take one small step in the direction of change. Change will come. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to present.